In 1892, a beetle no bigger than a grain of rice crossed from Mexico into Texas. It was called the boll weevil, and over the next 20 years it ate its way across the American South, destroying the cotton fields the region lived on. Farms collapsed, and families went hungry. Then a scientist at the Tuskegee Institute, George Washington Carver, told ruined farmers to plant something they had always written off as food for the poor: peanuts. That single decision, set off by a beetle, is how peanut butter reached your shelf. But the man we credit never actually made it. But this story doesn't start with a beetle, or with Carver, or even in America. To find the beginning, you have to go back about 3,000 years and travel 4,000 miles south to the warm soil at the foot of the Andes Mountains. The smooth paste you'd scoop from a jar today began as something far stranger. Here, roughly 3,500 years ago, a low green plant is doing something almost nothing else on Earth does. Its yellow flowers bloom above the ground, like any normal flower. But once they are pollinated, the plant bends a stalk downward, pushes it into the dirt, and grows its fruit underground in total darkness. Botanists call this geocarpy. The plant, quite simply, buries its own seeds. Picture it. The flower fades, a slender stalk called a peg reaches down, touches the soil, and keeps going, carrying the future pod into the dark where no sunlight ever reaches. And this is the first thing nearly everyone gets wrong. The peanut is not a nut. Walnuts, cashews, and almonds grow on trees up in the light. The peanut grows beneath your feet, in a pod closely related to beans, peas, and lentils. It is a legume wearing a nut costume. Think about that for a second. The most famous nut in the world is not actually a nut at all. The ancient peoples of the Andes didn't care what we would one day call it. They cared that it grew easily, stored for months, and was packed with energy. And at some point, in a kitchen we will never see, someone roasted a handful, crushed them against a stone, and watched them turn into a thick, oily paste. That was peanut butter in its very first form, made thousands of years before the first jar, the first label, or the first sandwich. For a long time, the peanut stayed close to home, a quiet South American secret. That changed in the 16th century, and it changed in the most violent way imaginable. When Portuguese and Spanish ships reached the Americas in the 1500s, they found this strange underground crop and carried it back across the ocean. In Africa, it thrived in the soil and became a staple. Then the transatlantic slave trade tore millions of people from West Africa and shipped them to the Americas, and the peanut traveled with them, in the holds of those same ships. The enslaved West Africans already knew this plant. They knew how to grow it, roast it, and grind it. Even the word we still use carries that history. Goober comes from nguba, a word from the Congo language of Central Africa. So the peanut made a full brutal loop. Born in South America, carried to Africa, then shipped back to North America by the very people who understood it best. And for generations after, that history clung to it. In the American South, the peanut was seen as cheap food, animal feed, the crop of the poor. Nobody important was paying attention to it, which is exactly why what happened next caught everyone off guard. Which brings us back to that beetle. By the early 1900s, the boll weevil had turned the cotton South into a disaster zone, and George Washington Carver was telling ruined farmers to plant peanuts instead. But Carver's idea was smarter than just swapping one crop for another. Peanuts are legumes, and legumes do something quietly remarkable. They pull nitrogen straight out of the air and feed it back into the soil, repairing the exact ground that decades of cotton had drained dry. Plant peanuts, and you didn't just get a harvest, you got your land back. To prove the crop was worth it, Carver published a bulletin with more than 100 different uses for the peanut, from cooking oil to soap to a ground-up paste. He turned a poor man's crop into the future of southern farming. But here's where the version you've heard falls apart. Carver is the name almost everyone gives when you ask who invented peanut butter. It comes up in classrooms and trivia nights all over the world. And it just isn't true. Carver was a brilliant champion of the peanuts. He was not the man who first put it in a jar. So who was? The trail runs north to Montreal, Canada, and a man named Marcellus Gilmore Edson. In 1884, decades before Carver's bulletin, Edson patented a process for milling roasted peanuts into a smooth paste, even adding a little sugar to firm it up. It's one of the earliest modern peanut butter patents on record, but the person who shaped it into the food we'd recognize was a doctor with a very particular obsession. In 1895, John Harvey Kellogg, yes, the breakfast cereal Kellogg, patented his own method for making peanut butter. He ran a health sanitarium in Battle Creek, Michigan, and he needed a soft, protein-rich food for patients who had lost their teeth or could barely chew. Ground peanuts were perfect. To Kellogg, this wasn't a snack, it was medicine. If you are enjoying this journey through one little jar, please subscribe so you do not miss the next story. Now back to this one, because in 1904, peanut butter was about to meet the public in a very big way. That year, the city of St. Louis hosted a World's Fair, one of the biggest gatherings on the planet at the time, drawing close to 20 million visitors across its run. The fairgrounds stretched over hundreds of acres of electric lights, new machines, and foods most people had never seen. And somewhere in that crowd, vendors were spooning out this odd, creamy peanut paste to ordinary people. For huge numbers of Americans, that fair was the first handshake with peanut butter. It worked. They wanted more. There was just one problem, and it was stubborn. Early peanut butter would not hold together. Leave a jar on a shelf and the oil crept to the top, separating into a greasy layer you had to stir back in by hand. It went rancid fast. It was messy, inconsistent, and hard to sell. Everything was in place for peanut butter to take over the country. It just could not survive the trip to the store. The man who fixed that was named Joseph Rosefield. In the early 1920s, he worked out how to apply a process called hydrogenation to peanut butter, partly solidifying the oils so they stayed evenly mixed. Suddenly, the paste was smooth, stable, and could sit on a shelf for months without separating or spoiling. Rosefield used it to launch a brand you have almost certainly eaten, Skippy, in the early 1930s. Skippy pulled one more trick too. It stirred chopped peanut pieces back into the smooth base, and just like that, crunchy peanut butter was born, kicking off an argument families still have at the breakfast table. Competitors poured in. Peter Pan hit shelves in the late 1920s, and in 1958, a company you know better for soap, Procter & Gamble, launched Jif. The paste an Andean cook once ground against a stone was now a factory product, fought over by corporations. But peanut butter's biggest leap had nothing to do with a factory. It happened in a war. During the Second World War, American soldiers were handed both peanut butter and jelly in their rations. And out in the field, exhausted and far from home, they did the obvious thing and spread them together on bread. The peanut butter and jelly sandwich, the one you probably ate as a kid, was supercharged by hungry soldiers looking for fuel that would not spoil. When they came home, the habit came with them into kitchens across the country. So step back and look at what that ancient paste turned into. It takes around 540 peanuts to fill a single ordinary jar. The average American gets through roughly 3 pounds of the stuff every year. Across a whole country, year after year, that's billions upon billions of peanuts. Each one pulled from the dark soil where it buried itself, roasted, crushed, and spread on bread. The kind of number that makes your head spin. And every one of them sits on an unbroken line that runs back to a stone tool in the Andes, thousands of years before anyone wrote a word of history. Which brings us all the way back to that beetle. An insect no bigger than a grain of rice crossed a river in 1892, wrecked the cotton south, and pushed a scientist to champion a crop everyone had ignored. That's the chain that ends with a jar in your kitchen. It still looks completely ordinary. A smooth golden paste on a butter knife. Except now you know it's anything but. It's a plant that hides its fruit in the dark, a survivor of oceans and slave ships and ruined soil. A doctor's medicine, a soldier's fuel, and a 3,000-year-old idea that somehow ended up on your spoon, all because a beetle showed up where it was not wanted. If you want more hidden histories like this, the kind sitting quietly in your kitchen, your pocket, or right under your feet, stick around. There's a whole world of them waiting.